Welcome to the Depth Dive. We've got a fascinating one for you today. It's about the origins of language, and we're going to be taking a look at this new study called,
Language emerged earlier than thought.
yeah, that's the one. Language emerged earlier than thought from Frontiers in Psychology. It just came out March 11th this year, 2025.
Hot off the press.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we've got some other stuff as well to kind of dig into this whole thing. So,
This is one of those topics for you that really gets to the heart of what makes us human, right?
yeah. I mean, it's so fundamental to how we think and how we interact. And
And how we experience the world, right?
absolutely.
Yeah. And this study is not just about tweaking some dates on a timeline.
Yeah.
It's really a pretty fundamental shift in how we understand when and how this key human capability arose.
Okay.
So what we're going to do is we're going to unpack this revised timeline for language, dig into the genetic evidence that supports it.
Which is super interesting.
Right. It's fascinating stuff. And then we'll really explore for you what this all means for how we see that connection between language and the development of modern human behavior.
Okay, so this is going to be a real deep dive into the evolution of, well, us.
I think so. Getting a fresh look at a really foundational part of our story.
Okay, so the headline of this new study is Language Emerged Earlier Than Thought. That obviously signals a pretty big change.
Yeah.
Like, what are the numbers here for you? What's the big takeaway?
Well, the new study puts forward a really compelling argument that the capacity for language in Homo sapiens developed at least 135,000 years ago.
Wow.
And what's really striking is that this isn't just like a little adjustment to a timeline. It's a considerable departure from what we previously thought.
Yeah, because I was going to say, thinking about how language developed, that timeline for me feels a bit fuzzy.
Yeah, for most people, I think.
What were some of the, I guess, more common ideas about when language really started to develop?
Right. Well, a lot of the earlier theories pointed to a more recent emergence of complex language,
Okay.
often around the Upper Paleolithic period.
Yeah.
So roughly 50,000 to 70,000 years ago.
Okay.
And the thinking there was that language and those other advancements in human behavior that we see in that period, like more complex tools, art, all of that, symbolic behavior,
Right.
kind of went hand in hand. The development of these things were kind of linked.
Right. So this new study is really challenging that then. Like, what is the big
It is.
piece of evidence that's making researchers rethink this?
Well, the crucial element here, I think, is the approach.
Okay.
Instead of relying on traditional archaeological findings,
Yeah.
like ancient tools or cave art appearing at a certain time,
Okay.
this study grounds its timeline in genomic evidence.
Okay.
So they're looking at when early human populations actually started to diverge from each other.
So for you, how can looking at our genes tell us anything about something as abstract as language?
Yeah, that's a great question. It comes down to a really fundamental point, right?
Okay.
All modern human populations have language,
All right.
right? Every single one. And despite the huge diversity of languages we see in the world today,
Yeah.
there are these underlying similarities,
Oh, okay.
right, that suggest a common origin.
Right.
So for this to be true, the potential for language, the capacity for it,
Okay.
must have been present before these populations spread out across the globe
Okay.
and became genetically distinct.
Okay. Yeah.
So this study identifies the first major split in human populations as happening approximately 135,000 years ago.
Okay. So I'm seeing the logic for you.
Okay, good.
If everyone who branched off at that point
Uh-huh.
had the foundation for language,
Yeah,
then that foundation must have existed before they branched off.
precisely.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's
Okay.
a really powerful piece of reasoning.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what's particularly interesting is that this suggests the initial development of the capacity for language was likely an internal cognitive shift.
Okay.
So within individuals,
Right.
before it became a widespread tool for social communication between groups.
Right. 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 So it's this distinction between the internal potential
Yeah, exactly.
versus using it to connect with other groups.
Yeah. It's a really important distinction to grasp.
Yeah. And the study does give us an idea of when that shift to more widespread communication might have happened, right?
It does, yeah. The study estimates that the more widespread use of language for social communication probably began around 100,000 years ago.
Okay.
And interestingly, that time frame aligns more closely with the increasing evidence we see in the archaeological record for symbolic behavior, like things like body decoration, using pigments or beads, and the creation of those ochre pieces with the deliberate potentially symbolic engravings.
Right.
Yeah.
So we're looking at a pretty significant gap then, right? Like 35,000 years
35,000 years.
between having that capacity
Yeah.
and actually using it to communicate with each other.
It's a big chunk of time.
Yeah, that's huge. So
Yeah.
what are the implications of that gap for our understanding of how language evolved?
Well, that 35,000-year gap is where I think some really profound insights can emerge for you,
Okay.
because it suggests a potentially very long period of internal cognitive development,
Right?
where the structures for language were forming and perhaps even being used for things like internal thought, planning, or maybe even very, very basic forms of communication within small groups.
Okay.
Before it blossomed into that complex, socially shared system that we know as language today.
Right, right, right.
So this could give us crucial clues about those really early stages of human thought
Okay.
and how it began to be externalized, shared.
Right. Fascinating. Okay. Well, let's delve into that genomic evidence a little bit more. You mentioned the researchers looked at 15 different genetic studies.
Yeah.
What kind of genetic information were they analyzing?
They looked at a really broad range of genetic data from those 15 studies, which were published over the last nearly 2 decades.
Yeah.
This included examining Y chromosomes, which are passed down through the male line,
Okay.
mitochondrial DNA, which is inherited from your mother,
Right.
and even complete genomes, which gives them a very, very comprehensive view of human genetic history.
Okay. And so for you, how did they connect all that different information
Good question.
to the emergence of language? What was the core idea there?
Well, the central idea, like was touched on earlier, is that universal presence of language
Uh-huh.
in all modern human populations, right? And that evidence that all languages share some fundamental
Okay.
underlying features pointing to that common origin.
Right. Right.
So if you trace the genetic ancestry of all these diverse populations back to a point before they geographically separated,
Yeah.
any fundamental human trait that's present in all of them, like the capacity for language, must have been present in that ancestral population.
Makes sense. Okay.
Yeah.
But to pinpoint that 135,000-year mark
Yes.
for the initial population split,
Yeah.
what specific markers in our genes were they looking at?
The study really emphasizes the analysis of single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs.
SNTs.
So think of SNPs like tiny, unique markers, almost like family names within our DNA.
Okay.
Right. So by looking at the patterns of these SNPs
Yeah.
across different human populations, researchers can estimate when those populations last shared a common ancestor.
Okay.
Right. And the evidence from these SNP analyses really strongly indicate that that initial major division within Homo sapiens occurred around that 135,000-year mark.
So we're reading the family tree of humanity through our genes, and
our genes,
the potential for language had to be there on the main trunk before the big branches appeared.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. That's a really
Powerful approach.
powerful and precise way.
Very precise
Yeah.
to investigate.
Much more than we've had before, I think.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so let's shift our focus now to that transition from this internal linguistic capacity to the language we use to connect with each other.
Okay.
The study puts that around 100,000 years ago,
Uh-huh.
and that seems to line up with some interesting things we see in the archaeological record, right?
It does, yeah. That estimated timeline for the wider adoption of language
Right.
as a tool for social communication coincides with a noticeable increase in what archaeologists interpret as symbolic activity.
Okay.
So this is when we start to find more consistent evidence of things like body decoration, using pigments or beads, and the creation of those ochre pieces with deliberate, potentially symbolic engravings.
So it seems like the flourishing of language went hand in hand with
Yeah.
this explosion of symbolic expression.
I think that's a strong implication.
Right.
Yeah, and that 35,000-year gap we keep talking about.
Becomes even more significant in this context, I think.
Right.
Because it suggests this period where the cognitive machinery for language was in place.
Right.
Maybe being used for internal thought processes, planning, even very, very basic forms of communication.
Yeah.
But before it fully developed into the complex system needed for widespread social interaction and the sharing of symbolic meaning.
So it's almost like, to picture it,
Yeah.
the brain had the basic hardware for language, but it took a significant amount of time, and maybe some social pressures as well,
Yeah.
to develop the software, the sophisticated software for complex communication.
I think that's a really insightful analogy.
Okay.
Yeah. During that 35,000-year period, we might have seen a very gradual refinement of linguistic structures, the development of more nuanced ways to express abstract ideas, and the establishment of those shared understandings within groups that eventually paved the way for the incredible diversity of languages that we see across the world today.
That's amazing to think about. So this brings us to a really fundamental question for me.
Yeah.
Was language just something that emerged alongside other developments in human evolution?
Yeah.
Or was it actually a driving force in shaping what we think of as modern human behavior?
Right. Yeah.
This study seems to suggest it was more of a catalyst.
Absolutely. Yeah, the study presents this really compelling hypothesis that language wasn't just a byproduct
Right.
of our evolving brains, but that it may have acted as a really significant catalyst
Okay.
in human evolution, potentially triggering the more widespread appearance of those hallmark modern human behaviors around 100,000 years ago.
So going back to that 35,000-year gap,
Yeah.
how might that period link this early linguistic capacity to those later behavioral changes?
Well, the argument is that this period allowed for substantial internal cognitive development, and that development was fueled by this nascent capacity for language.
Okay.
So the variability to categorize to abstract concepts,
Right.
to represent the world through these internal linguistic structures,
Yeah.
even if they weren't yet fully expressed socially, could have driven new forms of thought, problem solving, and innovation.
Yeah. And there's that great quote from Shigeru Miyagawa at MIT
Yeah.
that really kind of sums this up, doesn't it?
It does. Yeah. Miyagawa states, quite unequivocally,
Yeah.
language was the trigger for modern human behavior. It stimulates thought and facilitates innovation.
Right.
So this perspective really shifts the focus.
Right.
Right. It suggests that language wasn't just this tool for communication that arose after other cognitive advancements, but that it was a central engine driving those very advancements.
Right. So this is quite a different way of looking at it
It is.
compared to, I guess, more traditional views.
Yeah.
Where did language typically fit into the picture of human evolution?
Well, traditionally, language was often seen as being linked to or developing somewhat in parallel with
Okay.
other factors like the invention of more complex tools, the formation of larger social groups, adaptation to changing environments. While those factors were undoubtedly important,
Yeah.
this new perspective positions language as potentially playing a much more fundamental
Okay.
and initiating role in the emergence of those behaviors we recognize as distinctly human.
Okay. So to kind of bring it all together for you,
Yeah.
the key takeaway from this deep dive is that based on this new study analyzing genomic data,
Uh-huh.
the capacity for language in Homo sapiens appears to have emerged significantly earlier than we previously thought,
Significantly earlier.
at least 135,000 years ago.
At least. Yeah.
And this precedes the widespread use of language for communication by a considerable margin,
Yeah.
around 35,000 years.
A huge gap.
And this early linguistic capacity may have been a crucial driver
Yeah.
in the development of modern human behavior.
Precisely. Yeah, the genomic evidence offers a really compelling new perspective on that timeline.
Right.
And that proposed link between this earlier linguistic capacity
Right.
and the subsequent flourishing of symbolic culture.
Right.
And complex behaviors presents a fascinating new way to understand our own origins.
Yeah. It really makes you think about those 25,000 years.
It does.
You know, what was going on. Like,
Yeah.
what kind of internal mental landscapes
Yeah.
were our ancestors inhabiting if they had this capacity for language,
Yeah.
but weren't fully using it to communicate as we do?
Right.
It's so interesting. It opens up,
Really profound questions. You know?
yeah, about the nature of thought and
Yeah.
how that intertwines with language.
Absolutely. And if you consider this revised timeline,
Yeah.
it really makes you reconsider how the very foundations of human culture, our shared stories, our beliefs, our innovations,
Yeah.
might have been shaped by this early and perhaps initially internal linguistic capability.
Right.
It's a powerful idea to ponder.
A powerful idea indeed.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for taking that deep dive with us.
Oh, my pleasure.
It's definitely given me, and I hope you listening as well, a lot to think about.